Welcome to The Criminologist, the podcast dedicated to educating and entertaining our listeners. We bring you subject matter experts from around the world and share the latest and greatest evidence-based practices and interventions to help individuals desist from a life of crime and delinquency. Now, please welcome the host of The Criminologist, Joseph Arvidson.
Well, hello and welcome to episode 214 of the Criminologist podcast. Happy to have you all with us today. We have an incredible episode lined up for you all, featuring two absolute legends in the field of criminal justice, specifically in the arena of evidence-based practices. Bogue and Guy Bourgon. Trust me, this is a conversation you will not want to miss. For those who may not be familiar, let me take a moment to introduce you to these pioneers in the world of probation and parole supervision. Both of these individuals have played critical roles in advancing evidence-based practices in corrections and have left an indelible mark on how we understand and implement interventions for justice-involved individuals. Bogue is truly a giant in this space. He has been working in corrections, mental health, and addiction services since the early 1970s, beginning his career in a therapeutic community in New York. Since then, Brad has accumulated over 50 years of experience authoring foundational works and designing groundbreaking tools such as the Risk and Resiliency Checkup Assessment, and of course, his role in constructing the Effective Supervision Practice Model, also known as ESP. Brad has also been the driving force behind innovations like automated case planning systems and the proxy risk tool, all aimed at enhancing outcomes in the field of corrections. Would be remiss if I did not mention Brad's background in motivational interviewing. Equally impressive, Brad was personally trained by William Miller, one of the founders of the MI approach, and he has since dedicated his career to training others and really embedding MI into correctional systems at scale. Dr. Guy Bourgon, hailing from Ottawa, Canada, has had a profound impact as well. A clinical psychologist by training, Dr. Bourgon has spent decades studying and refining methods to improve outcomes for justice-impacted individuals. He is most well known for co-developing the STIX practice model alongside Dr. James Bonta, a practical, skills-based approach to help corrections professionals implement effective, client-centered interventions. His work on risk-need responsivity has profoundly influenced modern correctional practices, ensuring that interventions are more targeted, efficient, and individualized. Dr. Bourgon's work emphasizes program fidelity, ensuring that evidence-based interventions remain effective when scaled up. His research has fundamentally changed how we think about applying the science of corrections to real-world scenarios, bridging the gap between research and practice in a way that makes a tangible difference for practitioners. Today, we are diving deep into their thoughts on the current state of evidence-based practices, their contributions over the years, and where they see the future of corrections heading. It is going to be an enlightening discussion with two of my personal mentors and two men I consider close friends. So please, sit back, enjoy my conversation with Guy Bourgon and Bogue, and I'll see you all on the other side. Well, welcome to the show, to the two of you. I've been looking forward to this interview for quite some time because I can say with authenticity, if someone were to ask me, were to look at my career, to look at my body of work, if you will, and say, boy, Joe, who are two of your big inspirations that set you off on your journey down the evidence-based practice rabbit hole? I would say unequivocally, Guy Bourgon and Brad Bogue were two of the biggest influences in my career. And I want to, A, both thank you for that, but B, start to unravel that and unpack that and talk about how our three sort of trajectories have crossed and where we're on the same page on things and really where we see the field of community corrections going, because I think we are at kind of a crossroads as the vocation advances, and we're doing a lot of self-reflection and almost looking at our own sort of role clarification, if you will. So why don't we kick it off for the listeners out there who may not be as familiar with the two of you with a couple of brief introductions, and I'll defer to either of you to step up, introduce yourselves, maybe just give our listeners, because I know we have a lot of younger listeners and or even students who are curious how to maybe map out their trajectories. What got you into the field? Maybe a synopsis of your work academically, vocationally, et cetera. And then we can start chopping it up on some of these amazing topics.
Howdy, everybody. My name is Brad Bogue, and I'm the director of Justice System Assessment and Training, which is a closely held company I founded about 28 years ago. And after about 10 years working in the public sector and probation and for the Division of Criminal Justice here in Colorado, and then prior to that in private community corrections. So I got started in 1970, 71, as I finished a year-long residential treatment program with a several-year sentence over my head. A great incentive to finish the program, by the way.
Is that an approach goal or an avoidance goal, Brad?
Yeah. And as I graduated, I was invited to go on staff, and I went on staff there. That didn't last very long because my girlfriend left the program, and after it was about a 2-month gap there, and then I left the program. And so that was my first experience. So kind of in a role of worker, working with other people. In this case, they were called clients. And back in those days, the therapeutic communities were still pretty woolly and wild. And they were open to a lot of experimentation of different modalities, trying different things, at least the one I was in. So it wasn't really didn't have much fidelity to Daytop or Phoenix or Synanon or some of the other classic TC models, but it was really instructive, and I just learned a ton because you're living with everybody in that environment. Coincidence? I'm not sure I believe in coincidences anymore, but there's a number of coincidences that got me in the field and kept me in the field. One of them, I was riding a bike across the country, and I ran out of money and had to camp in the woods and get a job in Myrtle Beach. And I mentioned I went to a retreat center there, the Mayor Baba Center, and I was having lunch with some people, and I overheard them talking about a Rich Gall. And I said, "That's not Rich Gall," and I described him and said, "Yeah, that's the same person." And I got his number. That was my counselor, my primary counselor in the therapeutic community. And I called him, not right at that moment, but when I finally got the money, got on my bike again and got back home in Miami, I called him, and he said he was starting a treatment program and would I like to work for him. He didn't care about any credentials or anything with that. He just, would that work? And I said, yeah. And I went up there and I worked for Alternatives, Inc., which is still running. I think it's twice won the national award of the best juvenile treatment program in the country, and I think deservedly so. But my interest was getting the energy in startup programs. I just love that. There's so much going on and cooking when a new program is underway. It's very intoxicating almost to me. The creativity and the co-creating that's going on. And when it's working. So I had that experience, and then Rich canned me after about 6 months. Because I was getting stressed out because I couldn't compete or keep up with the counselors. Most of them, well, all of them had degrees, and about half of them had advanced degrees. I had a GED, and it just wasn't lining up right. My street experience wasn't sufficient to do the job, and I sort of knew it in my heart of hearts. And it was kind of a mercy firing, I think, by Rich to let me go. And not long after that, I made my mind up that I guess I really need to get educated, and which I did, and fits and spurts, and still continue to do. And in '82, I started working in community corrections, residential halfway house, and worked up through the positions in that to assistant director, and then went on to work in the state government for the Division of Criminal Justice, in charge of evaluating community corrections around the state, and then went into judicial branch and started working. And for 5 years, I was in charge of implementing a very massive standardized assessment program for parole, for probation, for community corrections across the whole state. So it cut across different departments and even branches in the government, and was an exciting project. But I suffered some burnout, and I decided the best thing was to kind of quit while I was ahead, kind of, as far as successful projects in government, and start working from the outside in. Because I recognized in that would have been 97, that evidence-based practice, I think it was just coined in that year by the Surgeon General, the term, and I'm not even sure if I was familiar with it at that time, but that the idea of what works in a body of knowledge was here to stay. It wasn't going away, and we were through with the flavors of the day in some sense, or at least that was my hope. And I think to some degree that's proven true. And so I started my company, Justice System Assessment and Training, and the timing was right, and we caught a lot of work. I was able to expand steadily over the next several or more years. And now, after 27 or 28 years, I'm being very selective about the work I take on. I'm very selective about the staff that I have and still work with. The projects I have, I enjoy immensely, and I hope I get an opportunity to talk about at least one of them, which has to do with training officers not in evidence-based practice and training them in mindfulness. And Guy, you might get a kick out of this because it's kind of in your backyard. It's the whole province of Ontario. All officers, all parole officers, all probation officers have at this point mostly all been trained at one level or another. And now I'm analyzing the research from that, and it's very exciting to me to look at the design. So that's a pretty windy introduction. So, but I hope it's adequate and thorough.
More than adequate, more than thorough. And I'm actually made a note. I want to circle back on that mindfulness project before we wrap this up today, Brad. Guy, you and I first crossed paths many, many years ago, back when they still called it ICCA, in an ICCA conference, I want to say. I can still vividly remember I stayed back after your talk and you sketched out on a cocktail napkin your spot the dog training that we had just heard about, but I was just so intrigued by it. And I think part of it was I really appreciated, as I still do, and my students and devotees know this, I just love the imagination you brought to it, just sort of that outside the box thinking of, okay, we all know that in our field, if we can merely get our clients to understand the thought behavior link, that is huge. And And again, I really appreciated the innovativeness of that. But as Brad did, introduce yourself to our audience and touch on some of those highlights throughout your illustrious career.
Yeah, I'm Guy. I'm your American who lives in Canada, because I was born in San Francisco. But I oftentimes when I travel to the States, I sort of mention that. As Brad was talking, it occurred to me that sitting here is Brad Bogue and Joe Arvidson. And I think back to probably like the early 90s. And, outside of the gang at the University of Cincinnati, there was only two other names that would often come up across with R&R and LSCMI stuff. And that was you two guys. And I remember sometime early in the 90s, I actually went to Colorado, and I don't even remember what we trained on, but me and a colleague went there, and it was sort of like, hey, I'm close to Brad and Joe. And that anyways, that just, it made me reminisce. I was lucky enough to be in Ottawa during the hotbed at the time. I went to school at the University of Ottawa. My thesis supervisor was the thesis supervisor of Jim Bonta and Don Andrews' Scotch drinking buddy on Fridays. And it was like, I could never meet him on Fridays. Anyway, so like I was sitting there with all of them literally through the 80s and the 90s. I remember doing an LSI when it was a paper version, and I think it said version 3 or something like that. So that was my sort of the way I got to grow up. We used to have these retreats in Eastern Ontario for our psychology departments for the corrections things. And, Paul Gendreau would always be there. Don Andrews would always be there. Jim Bonta would always be there. And like, I was just a young whippersnapper student. And it was like, there was always this value of going, do evidence-based work and do research at the same time to keep pushing the field. And those sort of retreats, I remember very fondly, and it was a little bit of partying and whatnot, but it was just, God, like there was the Canadian gang. I mean, Steve Wormuth was always there. And we were lucky enough that we had administrators, because I was working in a treatment and correctional center at the time. We always got support to do our stuff, and we were far enough away from anybody that everybody just kind of let us be innovative and whatnot. And Brad was talking about that innovation, and that's one of the things that I think keeps me going, is always having that strive to sort of learn, try new things, make it make sense, and let's go see what happens and follow the evidence along the way. Anyway, so it's like I spent a good 10 to 15 years. It was a long bit in that correctional center, treatment center. I got to work in a detention center for some time. Jim Bonta was, way back when, was my supervisor on top of that as I was a student. And he moved on, and sure enough, I don't know, probably about 15 years later, he became my boss again when I moved to public safety. Those years of doing treatment programs and working with both the people inside prisons and out on the community during that 15 years, I think was invaluable. I really got a taste of doing clinical work. I met some great colleagues along the way and learned all kinds of wonderful things. You talk about like what was a significant milestone. And this sort of cuts across some of the other stuff, especially the trauma stuff that you've been working on, Joe. I was doing an anger management group, and I was about as green as you could possibly be green. And I had my supervisor leading the group, and I'm just this young little kid sort of doing this. Here in this room was 6 very angry, very big, very nasty guys who were clearly just vibrating with anger. And I don't remember how the context, but all of a sudden, 2 of them started talking about the trauma they experienced. And it was like in vivid detail, and it was really gross, and I'm going to spare you all the details. And I was just sitting there watching them, and I remember thinking to myself, it is absolutely incredible the resilience that these people have that have lived through this, that are still alive. and still talking in a normal tone of voice. Yeah, I know they've got sort of issues and problems and got some strange behaviors and all this other stuff. And it's like, nobody's ever given you the chance to learn something different. And I watched them over the next couple of weeks, learning how to go, I'm tired of this. How do I change? And realizing that they had the power to change themselves. And that has probably always stuck in with me forever. And that's sort of, I guess, one of the principles I follow. Always believe that change is possible, and always learn and watch what happens.
Is it okay to jump in here?
Oh, please do, Brad.
I don't know how long ago that experience was that you had, Guy, but I only had that recently to develop some understanding about the difference between ordinary PTSD and complex trauma. And and I was on the receiving end of that evaluation, where I got I got with a really good therapist about three and a half years ago, and took the opportunity of COVID to get into therapy, to check it out, to see, maybe I have some trauma, right? And I did it was a 3-page inventory of just the traumas that I had. Almost all of them were up to a certain point in as a young man, or an adolescent, or a kid. And and then a year and a half of individual therapy every week, which I'm savoring it, and I'm still unpacking some of it in some ways. It's not by any means over, but I have this, now I have a different perspective. It's not something nominal. It's not a nominal understanding. You'd think that I would understand it because I went through it. No way. It just doesn't, for me, it didn't work that way. I couldn't access what was really going on. But now to some degree I can. And I'm thinking about all the people. I don't, the numbers look, the research is obviously expanding and growing, and really guiding, I think, things in a good way. So it's not an insignificant proportion of the population. And some, like Gabor-Mate, argue that all of humanity has trauma in one form or another. But what I'm talking about is the kind of trauma I had with complex trauma, layered trauma. And I see that in so many high-risk offenders, that the prevalence, and it'll be interesting to watch the research as it gets more focused on high risk versus medium risk and so forth. But I just think that's, one of the more encouraging things is because it's just ludicrous to think about how we can change people when they have not unpacked complex trauma. You're asking for miracles. Under those circumstances, almost. The other part of the other side of the coin is the people that are working with the people that have complex trauma.
Yeah.
And that's the one I've been working with in Ontario, to provide various kinds of training that center around mindfulness and becoming more self-aware and to more open to self-empathy and self-compassion. So really developing a solid platform of self-care and lifelong resiliency development. And for some reason, the Ontario province has always been kind of a beacon, I think, in corrections, but they've just moved in so aggressively about three and a half years ago or so, and to commit their workforce to get mindfulness training. And not just little doses or single doses, but different levels of trainings. And some are immersion, where they go off for a whole weekend. Some are 10 weeks, bookended by a whole day at each end, and then 2-hour communities of practice. That's probably the most common one. So that's a 30-hour dose just in mindfulness training. And back in the old days, it would probably be easy for a lot of administrators and leaders to dismiss that as, well, that's not going to count for much. What we need is some real tools.
True.
And I think that's changing. But and so far, one state in the U.S. is committed to scale up and did that successfully. That's Oregon. But outside of that, I don't know of any single system in the states so far that has scaled to the level that Ontario has. And the results that come in with pre-post surveys, and now we're moving into a panel design. So it's pre-post, 6-month follow-up, 12-month follow-up, is really encouraging, right? To see that the changes are there as self-reported in the surveys, like any longitudinal study, and the changes are sustained. And furthermore, it looks like, and this may be over-optimistic, but we are also getting measures of dose. So with mindfulness training, that's something that people take on and take home and dose themselves with, right? And so as they report that the dose at home is increasing, it looks like the effects are increasing. So it's kind of this thing. It's good for the goose, good for the gander.
Yeah.
And it makes sense if you think of, you go way back and you think of, like, are we our brother's keeper? That's a tough question, right? And I think mankind has struggled with that, and will continue to probably. But for me, I answered the question finally with, yes, I am. And that's what got me into the field in some ways, because I had experienced being kept, and I wasn't really happy with the way I was kept back in the 60s. So I think if you do agree with that you're your brother's keeper, i.e. you're the caretaker, then you probably agree it's good for the caretaker to get the oxygen mask on, right? Even though it's clumsy and it looks terrible, right? It's something worth getting on, right? And it does require some ego deflation, perhaps at points, to get into mindfulness training. But it's right up there in terms of equipment, oxygen mask equipment, good programs like you've been developing with Sticks and the practice model, Guy, which there's a number of things that I'm, forever a fan, and just I really admire your work. But those are in a way, to me, like cold, hard, absolutely necessary tools if we're going to be effective. And the way that you've worked with them to make them simple and fit into people's hands, so to speak, by the designs and so many other wonderful features in there that and I looked up today to remind myself the roadmaps are a great example of user-friendly tools, I think, to take very complex information and kind of translate it in a way that's available for action. It's action ready. So those are necessary, but I think, and I hope people will agree more and more, is that what's also necessary is to provide people that work with populations that with high prevalence rate of trauma and complex trauma need resiliency tools, need mindfulness training, need that as a core of what they're delivering, and then hopefully they will suit up, right, and be prepared to work with the kind of coaching platforms that are coming out in and coaching practice models that really require some flexibility on the part of the officers, right? And if they're getting in the grips of secondary trauma, we can't expect too much flexibility. Is my point.
Here's one of the things that I see in your example of doing this mindfulness for the workers in the field, like the officers and everything. To me, this is a really good, I'll be optimistic. I tend to be optimistic. And it goes with are we our brother's keepers? Correctional systems now are starting to realize that we can't just treat our staff, go do this and forget about it. Wellness in its many shapes and forms has really sort of taken a foothold across correctional systems. I see it a lot in the community correction side, and institutional stuff. That's another thing, but generally speaking, that's a recognition that we got to treat people humanly, and that's only going to trickle down if employers and systems start treating their staff and going, your wellness is important to us so that you can do your job well. Then that should trickle down to the way the frontline staff are interacting with their clients and with humanness. And certainly all the skills that they may learn for their own well-being, they're directly translatable to helping somebody else facilitate change, because that's what it's all about. It's learning. You are changing the second you learn. So you're learning stuff. And to me, that's very, very optimistic. And I really like that.
How do you see that gearbox working? Where, okay, so you've got a practitioner who's gone through some experiences and training and some discipline with development with themselves, so that they've got they've onboarded some additional resiliency tools. And like in some of our measures, we have 3 different tools that measure mindfulness, and they're multi-scale differential assessments for mindfulness. And it shows that certain things start perking up after the training, post-training, and then post their own home, the dose that they take home that I was referencing.
Yeah.
And so things like they're more aware of their senses, right? The light, the feel of water, when they're washing their hands or the dishes or the things. They report this on these kind of sensitive liquor items that comprise the different scales. So this is taken place, and they're more self-aware, and they've got some self-empathy going for themselves, right? They've got an inner dialogue. In other words, they're not just stuck outside. How does that
operate here? I'll throw this out here.
Yeah.
As a cognitive behaviorist, to me, it's just like, it's perfect. I've done, and Brad, I know you've done, Joe, I know you've done that. You've taught other professionals. And one of the biggest barriers to teaching people a new way of doing work, whatever that work might be, is their own bloody cognitions. The cognitions are not the same as our correctional clientele, but there's cognitions that get in the way. Mm-hmm. And one of the key things about mindfulness is going, hey, what's my cognitions, and sort of either getting around them, changing them, or just altering them, changing my thinking patterns in some way, shape, or form. And then they become less of a barrier. And when you become more aware of your own cognitions, thinking patterns, and everything, then you can start separating out, this is my thoughts and not what's actually in front of me. If anybody who's worked in corrections and you've run across this horrific case, don't tell me there's not some bias. We've got implicit bias that was sort of largely talked about during the pandemic, the George Floyd stuff and all this other stuff. There's more and more recognition that we can get in our own way of doing work that should be done. No correctional officer, no probation officer says, I want to make my people under my supervision worse. And they don't start there. They go like, no, I'm trying to protect my community. And it's like, that's where I start. And it's like, okay. They have a hard time sometimes seeing some of the things that they do are counterproductive to that. And that's part and parcel of being human. And that, to me, would be one of the mechanisms, Brad, that I can see is that they become more aware, then you've got more self-awareness, you're able to evaluate more clearly, and you're able to make better choices.
When you were sharing, Guy, I was hearing like your color system,
yes.
that helps identify automatic thinking, kind of, and help surface it. So the officer that's in touch with their feelings could probably much more quick, and this would be subject to some research, identify some of those patterns, help a client first, and know how to time it in a way that would help the client as well. So first identify it, then know how to time it, and then execute, a little bit of invitation to expand their awareness, with that, with the lessons that are the multitude of lessons that are available to help clients move out of marginalization. with their life. It also reminded me of I don't hear it anymore, but in corrections, the first couple of years you did everything you could for them. The next couple of years you did everything you could to them, and then after that you didn't care.
Yeah.
So I mean, I think what I hear is we're really getting more interested and informed about helping remedy that dilemma or that syndrome.
Yeah, I attended a talk you were giving at a conference here in Minnesota years ago, and a portion of it that stuck with me, of course, you said that you got up that morning and you just did a Google images search for probation officer, and the images you got, of course, were individuals with flak jackets, bulletproof vest, the badges, the pepper spray, doing home searches and whatnot. And it's had me thinking ever since then, and I think it to this day. I think the field is really going to, and this resonates to what you were both just talking about, sort of to steal some of Chris Trotter's language, a little bit of role clarification going on. I don't know if individuals necessarily even know when they're hired. Part of this is here in the States, we don't have one probation system. We don't even have 50 as in 50 states, because all those states have so many more, but they honestly, I don't think know what their role is. And I love the story you told Brad just now about, the first 2 years they do this, the second 2 years they do that. I've always been vexed as an evidence-based practice trainer that we have well-intentioned agencies and those probation officers can Monday morning get fitted for their vest or go to courtroom safety and defensive tactics. And then when they show up Tuesday afternoon for a motivational interviewing refresher, I'm confused why it's not resonating with them. And then Wednesday, they're going back to doing search and seizures. Thursday is a refresher on the thought behavior link. And they don't know which way they're going. And I know we've used that term change agent, and I know I've talked to Brian Lovins. There's not a lot of great work.
I really like Brian. He's really bringing that message home. It's a great word and great images that he does, especially for the U.S. audience. Mm-hmm. Y'all love your football there, okay?
But to your point, it's a great sports analogy.
It's a great sports analogy, and it really captures the spirit behind it all. And I see this a lot in at least most of the places that I get to work with. Of course, I'm probably a little picky, but that's what everybody's aspiring to is in some way, shape, or form. I want to be helpful. I've asked probably, I don't know, I'm going to go 10,000 probation officers now in my career. Why do you do what you do? And inevitably the word helpful is there. I want to help. And this to me is great. And Brian's a great speaker. And I like the fact that he's not just taking it, initially it was, hey, the officer's got to be a coach. You can't just sit on the sidelines and throw facts. If you really want something to happen, you got to go in there and you got to help them, play the game right. And he's stretched that down to include the whole organization. And that to me is, again, it's like the professional identity of, community corrections. And now it's creeping into even correctional officers inside of facilities now. I've had a couple of people that go, how can we help them be a little bit, some of them go, it's dynamic security. Okay, whatever. I don't care what your goal is, but you recognizing that this is a much better approach than sort of our previous approach to meet all of our goals as opposed to just a single goal. And I see this really taking a good, strong foothold, especially as I talk to the younger generation, not the people my age, but the younger generation, they sort of start there right off the hop. And they're more willing to embrace that right away. And the longer I work now, the more I see senior people or people who have grown up like me and going, yes, that's where I want to go. Help me change the culture. Help me change the identity of who we are and what we do and why we do what we do.
We know it all comes down to that all important culture. How much do you think are we sort of hobbled by those agency cultures? I'm thinking, for example, I was reflecting on this the other day and I thought, What does failure look like? If you were to ask your average John Smith probation officer, what does failure look like if all of a sudden we come to work on Monday morning and it's like, oh shit, did you hear he got fired? Oh, what happened? The answer would be, well, he failed. Yeah, what does failure look like? He wasn't getting his contacts in. He wasn't seeing his people in the community. He wasn't doing the requisite number of office visits. You would never get a response to that question of, oh, Guy wasn't exploring enough ambivalence around his clients' change targets, or Guy really fell behind on the number of cognitive.
He failed to comply with the requirements of the job. He breached his order.
Right. I mean, again, I just think at the end of the day, what motivates clients, a colleague of mine mentioned this once, and I just love it. What gets measured gets done. And unfortunately, in the United States, at least, what gets measured is, are you getting those field contacts in? Are you seeing somebody face to face? And I think that just leaves the impression with practitioners that that's what success looks like. That's how I move the needle. I just have to see this person face to face. The quality of the visit doesn't really matter. It's just that bean counter mentality. How do we start to shift that other than, of course, I'm always preaching, we have to start leveraging data. We have to start leveraging recidivism data, outcome data. But I'm curious to hear your thoughts on that.
What I'm seeing now is at least a willingness and an openness to go, our present data systems are not collecting quality measures.
Mm-hmm.
They're recognizing that and they're looking for, how can we do this that's feasible? I've always believed that the computer has been a double-edged sword, because I remember starting my career before we had computers and we had electronic typewriters, and that's how things got done. So the amount of information that we collected back then was a drop in the bucket to what we collect now. And what we've done is we've made it more and more a requirement to collect more and more information, but it's perfect for entering into a computer. You check yes or no, you put in a 1, 2, 3, blah, blah, blah. You upload their pay stub, you upload this, you upload, I mean, it's document overwhelming. And again, it speaks to what we count is what we consider success. More and more now, I'm seeing this. How can we do this in a way that's going to look at quality? And literally, as soon as you do that, then it's like, okay, well, what goes on behind closed doors? What's that? It's not about what they're doing in front of the computer. It's about what they're doing when they're with a client. That becomes important. And it's really up to, I guess, us and everybody else that work in this field to come up with feasible ways to do this and to start moving that needle forward. I'll throw this out there. Way back in, God, I don't even know when it was, probably early 2000s, the CPAI was the way an organization could assess whether it was doing well or not. And it was like, okay, great. Then we had a bunch of variations of that thing. And it was very organizational, and it was very checklist. Do you have a risk assessment? Do you check this? Do you do this? Do you have team meetings? And it's like, okay, great. Those were sort of the first cut at going, okay, do you have the components? We now know that even if you have those components, you could still fall on your face. It's because you've got it all, but it's not integrated, and you're not doing it with any kind of, some people call it fidelity. I'm going to go with quality. Doing it at the right time in the right way with the right person. And I find that that's one of my challenges, is to come up with a way to sort of help organizations, both at the individual staff level and the organization as a whole, to go, where are we falling down, and where can we go to sort of make some improvements? Because almost every jurisdiction now in North America has a risk assessment. Okay, great. Good. Oh yeah, every sex offender gets supervised as high risk. Oh, yeah, every domestic violence one too. Oh, those with gun violence, yeah, those two. Okay, yeah, it's like.
I just want to gently, carefully push back a little, not push. I'm not even sure it's push back, but just maybe turn to the side on that. It's like, I think with there's a lot of issues in the measurement, and what gets measured gets done. Mm-hmm. Has a certain ring to it that, and some truth. But I think the problem is deeper, and it's the proportions. It has to do with proportionality. Are we clear enough about what's really important in our work to orchestrate the measurements for it? There's a lot of people in the EBP business that think about change, although they'll quickly correct themselves if someone raises a concern about it. But they think this change is something that we're going to do, if not to, for other people. We're going to help, and that's a questionable assumption. My experience is change is only coming from within. It's not coming from the environment is a big factor. I'm not discounting that, but it's always the final vote is inside someone. What do they want to change? Mm-hmm. And what do we do?
Listeners, Joe, I'm nodding my head yes.
Thanks, Keith.
So, I worked with last time I talked to you, Guy, was about with the federal system, probation, parole, and a huge bureaucracy there, right? We're trying to change this bureaucracy. And we're working with looking at the measures and getting into their performance and their MIS systems and changing those and getting some routine, starting to scale up some routine organizational culture measures, like really cool tools like the organizational culture assessment tool, and get really sensitive measures of the cultures as they're coming online in the implementation. But to me, I guess I'm just old school now, and like I go back to Robert Pirsig and Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. He was asking through the classics in that novel or that story, what is quality? And in the end, he boiled it down to quality is taking pride. Quality is gumption and taking pride. And so I think we can maybe learn how to hire better for gumption, but we have to get out of the way of when it comes to taking pride. The more we try to saddle and measure people, I think the less options they have for pride. I think there's a dangerous thing that I wanted to raise that issue about. I don't know if you resonate with that, but I think that we can gum up the works with our work, with our efforts to improve. And what I've seen it helps with pride is safety first. Co-creation, mutuality, and letting people be who they are, uncover and admit who they are and allow who they are, and then revel in who they, really draw on what they've got in terms of talents. And that comes out of communities of practice, mm-hmm. in my experience. It doesn't come out of measurement. Let the communities will figure measures on the run, if they're necessary. On the other hand, Scott Miller's work, and this is the last thing I'll say on, is this just amazingly simple, boiling it down to a couple indicators, but make them consistent and make it every time. But that requires people come in loving feedback. And as we know,
sorry, I'm laughing out loud.
That's a difficult audience to find or create. So how do we get from being lukewarm at best about feedback to stepping into the breach to say, give me some feedback. I'm needing it. I'm wanting it. I found communities of practice the best way because it's very slow and safe, and it doesn't unfold jaggedly, like sometimes trainings can miss the mark because they're too soon or too late but communities of practice have a way of kind of adjusting to the weaker sisters that are in the group, and also enshrining or bringing clarity to the leaders, of the group.
I love communities of practice. One is especially if you've got a relatively small number of group, it allows for individual learning needs along the way. So that as opposed to this is a systemic. most correctional systems, hey, we're going to roll this out. Okay, it's systematic training for everybody. Everybody gets the same thing. Blah, 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 blah. Community practice, you can tailor it to the needs of the people of the group. When you have a good community of practice, the relationships are strong in that community of practice. So it's got a lot of, the great word is psychological safety, to allow for open, honest discussion, quick feedback, not seen as a threat, and all this other stuff. It's a great learning environment. And it's like, when I think of all the characteristics of a good community of practice that goes a long way, it's like, okay, well, let's try and create those elements that make it really good.
How about you, Joe? What's your experience?
I agree with your sentiments, Brad, that we need to slow down in our implementation efforts enough to realize the sort of the dynamic nature of what we're training, and also the folks that we are training. It seems like we blinked, and all of a sudden Robert Martinson's 1974 proclamation was, 50, 60 years ago. As was
with correctional staff.
Yeah. But I could say the same for, and I'm holding the 7th edition in my hands here of the Psychology of Criminal Conduct. And I think when we consider things like DESistance theory, for example, and if we were to have just put a stranglehold on fidelity of version 1.0 of R&R that came out in the first edition of the Psychology of Criminal Conduct, we wouldn't have broached any of the other legitimate topics that I've heard during this interview around trauma, which they address in the 7th edition. And Brad, I'm giddy to talk to you offline about your training in Ontario with mindfulness. And even, these themes you've talked about as far as what I refer to as the parallel practice and I love the analogy of the oxygen mask coming down. I would be criminally remiss if I let either of you leave here without getting even some informal feedback to the supervision model, that the TIDES model that my dear colleague and mutual acquaintance of each of you, Nicole Kimberly Staley, and I created, because I think we captured a lot of these shortcomings, for lack of a better term, in this conversation. We address things like self-regulation, identity, resiliency, which I heard, and of course, social support, in our efforts to sort of look at where we're at, see what's missing, and try to build that better mousetrap.
I'm the internal optimist. So I see this as the natural evolution of where we've come and where we're going. When I think back of way back when, it was do the CAN program that was substance abuse related. Okay, it was relapse prevention, blah, blah, blah. And then, we did this anger management. And it's like, do the CAN program. And it was, for lack of a better word, it was simplistic and very mechanical. And over the years, we've started adding different pieces to it, and it's getting slightly more complicated. But it's still, at least in the last 10 to 15 years, I could still see the mechanical pieces where we were inviting correctional staff to go, just do X, just do Y, teach this simple skill. And it was very sort of focused, and there wasn't much behind what's your bigger purpose, what are you trying to integrate into it, how are you trying to be holistic. And now when I see sort of the newer stuff, which includes the trauma piece, your identity, self-regulation to some extent, but like trauma and identity and resiliency to me are global constructs where you're now starting to integrate the whole person. And you have all the other pieces, so it's sort of like we've got a great foundation. Okay, let's put this foundation, and I'm hopeful that in our training and our education piece is we're showing people how all this fits together so that they have a much better mental map of where they're going and why they're going there, so they can see all the little steps along the way. Otherwise, it becomes a factory again and an assembly line. And working with human beings is not an assembly line. It's not. Don't kid yourself.
Right. Well, and the beauty of again, when we were putting the components of our TIDES model together, we kept leaning into that very theme that you resonated or that you talked about, which was regular listeners of the show know that my tagline when I sign off every episode is there's no them, there's only us. we're all hardwired the same. Nobody's born a criminal. I mean, things that we all know, but I've noticed in training, and I'm sure you two have too, that, so for example, Brad, training, motivational interviewing, how many times do you catch yourself saying, okay, if there's any parents out there, this is going to land on you, right? The more that we can use techniques or analogies or metaphors where the practitioner thinks, oh yeah, I raised a teenage daughter too. I get that, or this, and get away from, I guess, sadly traditional. Well, those people, that's the interventions you do on them, but not us. But if I'm trying to teach somebody to someone, again, if I can relate to it, or I've taught it myself, we're trying to break down that binary us, they.
I think we've got to do that. And you can do that in some packages that are somewhat soup to nuts, that you've covered a lot of things. But I do what I heard Guy saying is I kind of like real change is messier than we want it to be.
Mm-hmm.
Real change is messier than we want it to be. And we can, and God knows I spent a lot of time trying to create the right, configurations. And I was driven for a while by Ted Palmer's, multi-level, multimodal. And I kind of grokked that when I got it. And just, that gave me license to look at creating these models and programs that are multimodal and multi-level, right? Because I trust that Ted had this, I recognized something there that resonated with me deeply, that one size doesn't fit all. And actually, the first implication there is that, well, you need different sizes for different people. No, you also need different sizes for the same person at different times, So it's an important truth that we weren't prepared for. We don't have anything close to infrastructure like that. But now it sounds like, and I have to admit, I haven't seen the Tides model. I don't know if you sent it to me and I was asleep at the wheel or gave me a link, but I would love to look at it and appreciate what you probably end up with a lot of appreciation for the work you've done, Joe. With that, it's new to me.
I'll send it to you, Brad, and I can tell you that you were somewhat influential because, again, when we were trying to come up with what we eventually refer to as the 4 pillars of change in the model, 2 of those pillars are, I should say, self-regulation and social support, which was at least partly inspired by the interview that I did with you, the episode which was entitled Redefining the Needs Principle. And if you recall, you led me down that pathway of the issues around differential diagnosis and, sort of the ticky-tacky nature if we're asking a practitioner to measure leisure rec and now move to antisocial personality pattern, now go to criminal orientation. And at the end of the day, self-regulation, we could hang our hats on a lot of that. And again, how you reframed social support versus anti-criminal associates or that type of thing, and that nuanced difference between those. So those were highly influential. And then, like I said, the other pillars were identity, which of course we repurposed from the DESistance literature, and resiliency. And the beauty of these 4 pillars, and this came out of the conversation I had with Nicole, was every time I would bring something up to her from the DESistance literature in an effort just to sort of tutor her on that, be it identity, for example, she would say, oh, identity recovery, that's big in trauma-informed care world, Joe. And then she would say to me, what else is really big in trauma-informed care world, Joe, is this notion of resiliency. And I would say, oh, resiliency is a usual suspect in DESistance camp. And we sort of discovered that we were both building the same mousetrap with the same, it was sort of a Reese's peanut butter cup moment there. So we thought, okay, we can almost kill 2 birds with one stone or cover a lot of these bases. And the audiences that we've rolled it out to, whether in presentations or training, it's really resonated with them as well, whether they're in the trauma camp, the DESistance camp, the R&R camp, or all of the above.
Well, I'd love to see that.
And mindfulness techniques are part of that model as well, as far as the interventions, Brad, goes. That's why I said I'm eager to talk to you offline about the work you did in Ontario.
Yeah. Hey, I'm wondering if I, could take the liberty of sharing the screen. I know the viewers won't see this because I understand it's going to be an audio podcast, but it might be a slide you could get. But I'd just like to show you guys my last work in terms of the model building was to integrate theory together, and so it's in a visual format, and I think you'll kind of get it. Although one of the theories, which is kind of like it exists in only ivory towers, unfortunately, but it's 60 years old. It's called Problem Behavior Theory by Dick Jesser, and it's been validated in many different countries around the world. But it's just there's never been any reference to it as far as I can tell, except what I've shared on it. Nobody's picked up on the beauty of risk and protective factors together in a theory that has been still there, still Google, So here's risk need response. Here's the central 8, right? Color coded according to their potency. Here's DESistance theory, right? With moving from a condemnation narrative to a redemption narrative. And then here's the good lives model, looking at the concentration or focusing on the protective factors as, capital, human capital. And then here's the problem behavior theory is sitting in the background with the risk factors and the protective factors. And they're much more articulated in the problem behavior theory than they are in the theories that I've heard about PIC-R. They're really specified and researched with different research teams. But again, it's very academic stuff. So it's just looking at general populations and longitudinal research. But I think this sort of can hang together. And this DESistance, this narrative is to me sometimes the most helpful reference point for kind of working with people and looking at where they are in terms of their conversations that they're holding with you, and what does that imply about their self-talk? Where are they with that? What's going on? So I think it's starting to make a little bit of a sense, and I know that this isn't everybody's cup of tea. Nobody wants to think like this. But I do think that they are pointing at the same reality out there. And as you said, both of you, I think, said this is, we're just people, and the beauty of problem behavior theory is that Jesser kind of identified that people aren't, so much alcoholics or, burglars or this, that, and the other thing. That when people move into the ratio of risk to protective, it gets really high, and just they're in a syndrome of problem behavior, and they're opportunistic about how they manifest it. And furthermore, to think about it as these things as we've been conditioned to do. Here's mental health. Here's substance abuse. Here's social work. Here in these silos. Is going to always be frustrating when we don't, unless we can learn to think about it in a more integrated, interdisciplinary way. We're always going to be stuck, and that's part of the problem too, that we're trying to solve without the right support yet, I think, from the institutions, because they're self-reinforcing. They're reinforcing their blinkered understanding of what the reality is. In some ways, and I think there's a general movement to kind of want to move across or to get out of that. But as long as they're funded accordingly, they're going to probably continue acting that way. And so he founded the Institute of Behavioral Science, a beautiful, huge building on the CU campus overlooking the river, and four floors, all dedicated to nothing but interdisciplinary work. Which I think we really need. We also need, it brings up the issue where, I'm pretty sure I haven't seen anybody contribute as much to solving the problem as you, Guy, but we still don't have clinical supervision. I don't know how that'll get resolved. Do you guys have any?
The more and more correctional systems stop going, our staff is competent, we can leave them alone. the further we get away from that, the more and more we're going to get to ongoing learning and continual evolution of organizations and staff. As long as we keep evolving, that's great. Let's learn. Yeah, keep going.
Are there any brave new worlds out there? What's the frontier that you might see in the future? If we're having this conversation on a reunion podcast in 5 years, what look into your crystal balls, gentlemen, what might we be talking about?
Okay, I'm going to stay with my optimistic side.
Yes.
I'm going to go at the more senior supervisory levels of organizations. We're going to see a big shift in what they do and why they do it. And it'll align with sort of our continual evolution towards that sort of coach, change agent, evidence-based practice model along the way. And it'll be not just correctional organizations. I'll reach my neck out. We're going to start seeing this a little bit more at the bench level, aka judges. And that's what I'm hopeful for. Yeah,
I'm glad you brought up the judiciary. I was having this conversation with some international connections, but to your point, I was making the point. Yeah, it doesn't matter if you have an agency where all the probation officers are mint trainers and motivational interviewing, and they're all, and you have an army of LSEMI master trainers. If you don't get the bench on board, it's all for naught. Yeah, it's all for naught. To that end, Guy, and then I want to hear Brad's thoughts. But yeah, when I look in the future, if I'm being optimistic, we mentioned George Floyd on this call, and I thought there was a moment there when we were, maybe looking at redefining police, because I always look at this, and I mentioned this earlier when I said there's some role clarification going on. I just struggle to think that the practitioner, if we give them that license, if you will, to be in that surveillance lane, that containment lane, that's their get out of jail free card. Right? Well, you told me I wear two hats, and Brian Levins and I bristle at that term now. We don't wear two hats. That just gives license to the PO that wants to be on the law enforcement side.
One of them. Yeah.
Well, Tuesdays and Thursdays, I'm doing evidence-based practice. You said I wear two hats, and then Monday or Friday, I'm out with the sheriff's department doing random home searches because you said I wear two hats. And getting back to the George Floyd, I thought, okay, if we want to reimagine the police, that's where I see the spaces. Take those, what I contend are almost paramilitary roles that are in corrections, and offload those to your local law enforcement. There's we're going to bring back community policing and let the PO just flourish in that therapeutic role, and just solve this two hats confusion once and for all.
And I could see that it'll happen, I think, in a couple of jurisdictions. It'll be small, and that's like everything's got to start small. It doesn't start with the whole big bang.
Yeah, exactly. Brad, in 5 years, look in your crystal ball. What do you think we all might be talking about in the utopian future?
Well, two threads for me. One is less is better. We were contracted with NIC and NIJ to spearhead the Norval Morris project about 15 years ago. And we got some pretty good buy-in, which surprised me, from directors and commissioners around the country. At least a couple handfuls that said we need to cut the population down dramatically. They recognize that we're in this country, at least, we're burdened with too many, and too many that aren't going to get their needs met in the system. So that's one, and that goes against the grain, right? Bigger's better, So that's a toughie, and we couldn't quite get it all the way, and we probably needed more buy-in from some other organizations. Not probably, certainly did. We had a few, but so I think less, and also along with less is not trying to prescribe change plans for people that aren't interested. And I know that gets down to a question. There's some sticking points like, well, are they capable of making that decision for themselves at some points? But I've just come to the philosophical belief, and my values are, we don't have the right to try and change people. That's very coercive. That's a, I'm probably not in step with the mainstream thinking on that. But I think if we could do that and just work with the people that are interested, and I know there's sorting problems to that, we'd get further along. The second thread, I recently watched a movie about Robert Putnam, the fellow that wrote Bowling Alone. And he's doing a reprisal of his work in this documentary. His work, and for those that aren't familiar with it, he found and came out with a book that the trends, all the data he was looking at internationally, were suggesting that participation in community organizations and civic organizations was dropping dramatically and had been for decades and continues to now. So he was pointing that out and kind of like a warning, this doesn't augur well, especially for democratic societies where your bowling leagues are dropping off, your Kiwanis Club, your Rotary clubs, your this. So he was and it was really enjoyable catching up on that. But I was struck by, he doesn't deal at all with the individual level of social support. He's just dealing with which, I mean, that shouldn't have surprised me. He's a sociologist and a political scientist. He's not going to go to the individual level. But the individual level is part of that same trend and situation, I believe. And so do you have a confidant in your network or not? Right? That was a question that wouldn't come up in his work, right? So looking at the nuanced micro situation, one person to the other, what their networks look like, and how is that affected by civic participation in organizations?
Right.
So I think that will, I'm so encouraged lately by different things. I think that will come into play in the next several years, that we'll learn how to integrate and bridge across from police and through the community. Let the community, into the problem solving for the other arm, the front end, the law enforcement, and as well as the judiciary, and then for the back end, for those of us that are working in trying to help people re-embed in the community, is let some of this wonderful understanding that's been amassing for some time to start informing how we work with the communities. And I think ICA, what was formerly ICA, and now it is branded itself as a community justice, right? Something like that. So I think that's where the new younger people probably have the most energy to change. They want to change that. They want to roll in that, it seems to me. They want to co-create and be experience greater accountability for themselves and their communities. So that might be something to look for in the coming years.
When you mentioned social support, Brad, and again, you got me thinking about our TIDES model and the inclusion of social support, but how we really tried to differentiate between that, for lack of a better term, that traditional criminogenic companions, because we're, as you just articulated, discovering those nuanced differences. I think of, as a trainer, some of the catchphrases we use with new trainees. Well, how can I decide, Joe, if this individual is pro-social, antisocial? Which I've come to almost just redefine even that definition when we're scoring a traditional risk assessment. For example, I would say to somebody, or it's in the training book, well, if the client says, well, I met this person in prison, or I know this person from the probation office waiting room, historically, we would say, oh, that's antisocial. That's a risk factor. But the more we learn about social support, and the more we learn about desistance theory, it's more complex than that. So I was talking to my 89-year-old mother the other day, who still gets up, drives, and she once a week goes to, at her age, they don't have a high school reunion because the numbers are dropping. It's more like a survivors reunion of everybody she graduated from high school with back in, I guess, 1953. But she said to me, oh, Joe, I was so excited that the other meeting, I was the youngest person there. Yeah, it was all the 90 and 91-year-olds. But the point of my story is she was just glowing she's always glowing after these meetings. And she says, it's different, Joe, when I meet with these people. It's different when I meet with this community than when I meet with my family, friends who are decades younger. I've got that connection and it's a lot different. And I thought, yeah, with our clients, it's different. It's not as simple as, I'm thinking, Brad, of that traditional social support map that we train on. It's not just about surrounding yourself with the people with the plus signs next to them versus the minus signs. That just means, a lot of times involvement with the criminal justice system versus not. No, you've got to find your tribe, if you will. And I think social support captures that better than pro-social, antisocial.
Yes, and I think that's a constant journey that we're on through life, and whatever phase of life we're in. Mm-hmm. Like your mother's in that phase. We're always, birds of a feather flock together. We have a lot to learn from birds.
And again, I think of our historical approach we would take with those birds flocking together. If the probation officer says, "Oh, those birds did time with you," that's bad. Whereas we know from the desistance literature, people can desist together. Just as they dabbled in crime together, they can come out of crime together. Those folks with lived experience have so much to give.
I just have recent experiences. My more recent installments is through working in the community here locally, just informally and not professionally, just being part of the community, working with people. And I watch how the communities that I'm in understand when someone's in real dire shape, and they know, and they band, and they match up, and they don't match a whole gang of women with a man. They match a whole gang of men with a man, or women with a woman, and they don't lose sight of that person, and they don't assume too much, right? Because they know the person's in real dire shape, and it's not safe to assume anything. So they do it by smothering them, right? But not coercing them, just by, and I'm watching how people are pulling themselves together and things healing and, taking place that are just so significant and dramatic. And it has to do back what we were talking about, complex trauma. So when people are broken at many levels, what I'm used to seeing normally is just them repeating the cycle. It's a different costume, it's a different thing, but it's just the same. But this isn't that. You're seeing something different as people change their way of being with other people, and it's happening within months. It's happening almost in front of your eyes. I just find that it's kind of re-breaking my heart in a way. It's so why I came into the field, to make a difference, to help someone out like that, and I really think it's possible. I wanted to share one thing. I'm greedy about the time, but in the research we're doing in Ontario, we're I hope this doesn't get me into too much trouble, but I don't care, is that the older staff, so, there's maybe 1,200 people that have gone through some kind of different forms of mindfulness training. And we're seeing that that tend to be male, definitely older, definitely come in rating themselves lower on various mental health ratings, resiliency scale lower, significantly so, and are the ones that continue and go stronger at time 2 and time 3. Mm-hmm. They're the ones, it's sort of like the gift of desperation. It reminds me of, is like they sense that they have some need here, and they don't play around with it. They get real serious and they incorporate it in their shift in a lifestyle, Mm-hmm. And I think that's really, that's just one of the many, many good news things for me that's exciting me about the future, and I could go on about that one, but that's, because I'm hungry for good news. Mm-hmm. And it's there. I'm finding it's plentiful.
Yeah, like I said, it's an exciting time to be in the career. I was just at APP in Indianapolis, and you both know that, yeah, there's a lot of bright, promising minds out there with a lot of great ideas, and the field is ever evolving, as it should be. We should practice what we preach with adherence to evidence-based practices and keep on trying to build that better mousetrap. Guy Bourgon, Brad Bogue, thank you so much for this reunion. It was great to reconnect with both of you.
Thanks so much for having me, Joe. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, I hope we don't wait another cycle like this to talk again. It was really enjoyable talking with you and you, Joe.
I often tell folks, I don't really care as much about listenership. Just for me, selfishly, I just love reconnecting with people and learning from people, right? But this podcast serves as a mechanism at least to get us three together. So yeah, everything else is a bonus. All right, friends, until next time, take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
What an absolute pleasure it has been reconnecting with Brad Bogue and Guy Bourgon. It felt like a reunion of sorts of old colleagues, reflecting on not just where we've been, but where we're headed. So fun to share some of the same trials and victories and ongoing learning experiences that the three of us have shared in the world of corrections and evidence-based practices. Brad and Guy's decades of work have been monumental in shaping the landscape of modern corrections. It was inspiring to revisit some of those key moments of implementation and how far we've come. We also spoke candidly about the challenges we still face, but what really stands out is our collective sense of hope. Hope for a better future for those we serve in the field. And that's what drives us forward. It was particularly thrilling to discuss the TIDES supervision model with them today and to see their interest in how trauma-informed care and DESistance theory can blend into something transformative for those under supervision. It was a validating moment for me, knowing that the work that I am so passionate about, along with my co-creator, Nicole Kimberly Staley, really resonates with the two of the most respected voices in our profession. So as we wrap up today, I want to encourage all of you to reflect on the insights from this episode. Whether you're working in the front line of corrections or just passionate about improving lives, take these lessons to heart. There's always room to evolve, to connect, and to build something better. As always, I encourage you to reach out if you have any questions or comments as to this podcast. You can reach us via thecriminologistpodcast@gmail.com. That's thecriminologistpodcast@gmail.com. And of course, any interest in the TIDES supervision model is also welcome. I encourage you to visit our website, thetidesllc.com. That's thetidesllc.com. Stay tuned for our next fascinating episode. And until then, please remember, folks, there's no them, there's only us.
You know, as Brad was talking, it occurred to me that sitting here is Brad Bogue and Joe Arvidson. And I think back to probably like the early 90s. And, you know, outside of the gang at the University of Cincinnati, there was only two other names that would often come up across with R&R and LSCMI stuff. And that was you two guys. And I remember sometime early in the 90s, I actually went to Colorado, and I don't even remember what we trained on, but me and a colleague went there, and it was sort of like, hey, I'm close to Brad and Joe.
The Criminologist Podcast is a production of the Paragon Group, LLC. For speaking engagements, interviews, program design, or training opportunities, please visit us at theparagongroup.llc.com. If you enjoyed the show, you can find more content and videos on our YouTube channel, The Criminologist. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Both the Criminologist Podcast and the Criminologist channel are brought to you by the Criminologist Media Group. Be sure to give us a 5-star review, and thanks for listening.